It was a company where we had video editors that were used by every Oscar-winning movie. We dominated the video editing market. We doubled sales in 2024, then we again doubled sales in 2025 without even trying to hit OKRs. So we reduced customer churn from 26% to 4%. And we did all of this by puzzle setting and puzzle solving. When we don't have clarity and vision, we sort of use goals and OKRs as band-aid. There's a much bigger issue with OKRs than just the teams. Where OKRs came from, they're not a new idea at all. The very foundation of experimentation, learning, adaptation, rests on this idea that I just may be wrong.
Behind every successful product is a leader who's learned the hard way what not to do. From chasing the wrong deals to setting goals that backfire. In this episode, we'll explore the common diseases that derail companies, how to create a vision that actually drives results, and why it may be time to rethink your goals, your KPIs, your OKRs altogether. Our guest, Radhika Dutt, a MIT-trained engineer, entrepreneur, and an author of Radical Product Thinking, who's helping leaders worldwide rethink how products, companies are built. Radhika, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. Absolutely. And it sounds like right from the introduction, we're just going to cover a lot of material here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We had a great conversation last week about this exact concept. We're all trained as leaders to set goals, to have KPIs, to have OKRs, which again are all very valuable, but you had a very, I thought, an original take on how not to do it. So we're going to dive right in. Like, first of all, how did you even get to this point? In your journey, why did you decide that this is the problem you wanted to solve?
So one big thing I kept seeing with goals and targets was just negative side effects from goal setting. And yet, we'd learned this is how you build companies. This is how you build big businesses, how you motivate people. And yet I kept seeing, there are issues with this. And I'll give you an example. I was working at a company where we were setting sales targets, and you know what? Our targets were looking fabulous. We were hitting all of those sales targets. It was a company where we had video editors that were used by every Oscar-winning movie, every Oscar-nominated movies. We dominated the video editing market. But under the hood, like when you looked at how we were hitting those targets, it turned out our low end was being eroded by Apple and Adobe, even our mid-tier. And so the way we were hitting our numbers was going further and further into the high end. And we, as a company, kept investing in the video editing business. And the reality is, we should have just said, you know what? Let's put a do not resuscitate order on our video editing business and figure out, what should we do instead? How do we target the movie editing business when our video editors are getting commoditized? Or, maybe we should invest in a different space. We need news editing. Maybe broadcast is where we make the big investment, right? We had a broadcast division, but we underinvested in it. There's so many reasons why goals and targets sometimes, just hitting them, makes us think our strategy is working, because it creates this bias that everyone wants to show, yes, this is working. We're not looking at the bad numbers and saying, what's going on here? What should we do instead? What's the problem? We're not focusing on the puzzle to be solved by looking at the bad numbers. We present the good numbers saying, ta-da, target hit.
No, that makes sense. And you said that during your first startup, you suffered hero syndrome, you called it. What did that look like at that time, and what lessons stuck with you from that experience?
Oh, so this is a slightly different topic where, let's talk about the product diseases that I have come across in my career. So the first startup that I founded, it was right out of our dorm rooms at MIT. And this was back in 2000. Our vision was revolutionizing wireless. And if you ask me, it was grand, right?
Yes.
But we had no idea what that really meant. I mean, still, like revolutionizing wireless, what does that even mean, right? And this is what happens still in so many startups where we have these grand vision statements, but it doesn't describe anything. Let's look at Boeing's vision. That vision is to be the global enduring industrial champion in aerospace. Like, great. What does that mean? Is that by shareholder returns? Is that by revenues? Is that by market share? Like, how are we measuring this, right? And this is what happens when you have vision statements like we're taught that are actually, honestly, bullshit vision statements that are fluffy, but they don't provide substance as to what problem are we solving, etc. Then our teams are so sort of misdirected. It leads to the disease I call hero syndrome. Without knowing what you're going out to solve, we measured success by how much venture money we were raising, or which big logos we had as a customer list, even if we were giving away our product or service, etc. Right? So that's just one example of a disease. But there are other such diseases that I came across in my career, and a lot of that was because of a lack of clarity in our vision, and we didn't know how to systematically translate a vision into everyday actions. There was a break in the chain between translating vision into everyday actions. And I think for a lot of leaders listening, you probably see that. You know, we have a certain vision, we pack it away for posterity, and what we actually do in execution doesn't remind us anything of the vision, right? We're maybe chasing sales. That's another disease I call obsessive sales disorder, where we go off and, let's take this custom deal or custom feature so that we can win this big deal. Let's take this one too, and soon your product is just trying to do everything for everyone. So those are examples of product diseases. Ones like Pivotitis, where you keep pivoting, obsessive sales disorder, strategic swelling, where you're trying to do everything for everyone. Then there is hero syndrome, which we talked about. So those are diseases because we don't have a clear vision and able to translate that into our everyday actions. And the way it's related to goals and OKRs is that when we don't have clarity and vision, we sort of use goals and OKRs as Band-Aid, and we say, okay, here are fundamental foundational cracks, but let's see if we can just put some Band-Aids on it, maybe it'll all stay together. And that's our solution with OKRs.
Sure. It's almost like you're saying we're going to have the greatest trip of all time when you plan a trip, and then your OKRs are you showed up to the airport. You made it to the hotel, right? Like you booked a trip, you booked a hotel, but there's not a clear vision of what this greatest vacation looks like. So how would you respond to that? Like instead, what should we be doing when it comes to the vision statements and, the statements that are supposed to help the team understand what we're rowing to? What would you use instead?
Oh, I love your analogy. You're exactly right. I think it is measuring, having this greatest trip by all sorts of metrics, but that doesn't actually talk about, have you actually achieved this greatest trip? What is a greatest trip for you? So good vision helps you create that definition of what is the problem you're setting out to solve. Who has this problem? Maybe it's not everyone's problem. It's a very specific group of people whose problem it is. How are they solving that today? And then a big question, which is, why do you even need to set out and solve this problem? Maybe the status quo is just fine, right? Like so often in Silicon Valley, we set out to go disrupt, but maybe that problem doesn't need any disruption. Maybe the status quo, honestly, is just fine. And then you have to answer, what's the end state you want to bring about? And finally, this is finally where you've earned the right to talk about your product. How will your product bring about this change? So let's talk about what such a vision statement looks like. And in the Radical Product Thinking book, I describe such a fill-in-the-blank statement. But let's use this fill-in-the-blank statement for a startup that I had. It was a startup I founded in 2011 and sold in 2014. So here's how the vision statement would go. Today when amateur wine drinkers want to find wines that they're likely to like, or find wines that, or learn about wine along the way. They have to find attractive looking wine labels, or find wines that are on sale. This is unacceptable because it just leads to so many disappointing wines, and It's hard to learn about wine in this way. We envision a world where finding wines you like is as easy as finding movies you like on Netflix. We're bringing about this world through a recommendations algorithm that matches wines to your personal tastes and an operational setup that delivers these wines to your door. So this is a radical vision because I didn't tell you anything about my startup, but you knew hopefully exactly what we were doing and why we were doing it.
I'm hoping the startup was Vivino, because then you must have done something spectacular. Is it not Vivino?
No, actually, so we started out, and Vivino was around at that time, but we also caught some product diseases, and we can talk more about those. But yeah, we sold the company to another company called Drink.
Oh, cool. I've heard of Drink. Very nice. Good for you. Congrats. Hopefully that was a nice exit for you. You talked about something about the status quo being okay. I think too often startups forget that sometimes the status quo is fine and the cost of inaction is not enough for them to now take on another product, learn a new product, buy it, get the team to actually use it and give feedback. And so people don't understand that, right? They fall in love with their solution and yours is completely different. It's like you didn't mention anything except what the customer journey looked like and what hopefully the problem it was solving for the customers. So that was really good.
And that was a hard lesson too, by the way, because that's not how we started. I remember when we first started, a product disease that I'd caught was what I now call Narcissus complex, where you're looking at a feature that you want, right? Like what we started with was, oh, if I could have a view of a map and where all the wines that I'm drinking, where they come from, I would love to learn about wine in this way. Like if I could just have a map view of all of these different wines and where they're coming from. And I thought if I want this feature, everyone else wants this feature too. Right? And that is what I mean by Narcissus complex, that we're looking inwards in terms of what we want instead of thinking about what the problem is. And so how do you solve for this, right? First of all, exactly like you're saying, we do have to look outside, talk to customers, and what is it that they want? But there's a second piece of this, which is that we might have a vision that we start with, and we think this is exactly the right vision. And as we start executing, we discover this is actually not the right path. It turns out that we were wrong. In our case, when we started with this map view, it turned out that we were wrong. And it's important to have a vision statement that you can go back to and say, here's where we were wrong. Here's what we learned. And therefore, here's how our vision needs to change. That is how you avoid the disease pivotitis. Because, people often ask me, does that mean you never pivot when you have a vision like this? Is my vision set in stone? On the contrary, to avoid Narcissus complex, you go talk to customers, you discover the problem. But you start with this clarity of vision, just a stake in the ground. And to avoid pivotitis, instead of just sort of whiplashing from one idea to next, you pivot with Gravitas. You learn, you go back to your vision and you say, here's where we were wrong, what we're going to try instead. And you're bringing the whole team with you on the journey.
Oh, that's really good, especially if you keep pivoting. Your team is probably just a couple pivots away from like losing interest, right? And in sports they call it losing the locker room. If you keep just constantly change the strategy around and the vision, eventually they're like, yeah, this is just another pivot that we'll have a new pivot in a month. So I think it sounds like that the creating the vision. Pivoting before you even have a vision until you clarified your vision is a really good idea.
I love what you said. And, this is where the mantra in Silicon Valley is just keep pivoting until you find product market fit. Yeah. Whereas the reality is you have 2 to 3 pivots before you run out of money or momentum. And you have to pivot every time with Gravitas. Think of every pivot as a silver bullet. If you haven't thought through it and really thought about, where am I wrong? What have I learned? What would I try next? Then you're risking pivotitis.
Yeah, don't fall in love with your solution. Try to find the real problem, right? By pivoting before you pivot. You described all these awesome product diseases, which was the first time I'd heard of that concept. Which of these did you personally struggle with the most? You've mentioned a couple already.
So I shared some for my startup, but even when it's not my own startup, you sort of observe this elsewhere. So I'll give you one example of pivotitis. I was working at a startup where we wanted to be the next Visa of the world. And, that's a pretty lofty goal to set out to accomplish. So very soon we realized, actually, that's really hard because you have to acquire both merchants and you have to acquire consumers. So we said, you know what, we're going to pivot. We're going to be a loyalty solutions provider for merchants. And, so we tried that for about a month and we said, oh, you know what, that's a really crowded market. So we're going to pivot again. So then we decided to be a credit solutions company for merchants. And at the time, right, I was the VP of marketing. And honestly, at some point, I didn't even know what to write on the website anymore because I didn't know, what am I asking people to sign up for? And that's an example of pivotitis. And that's how, after a couple of such pivots, not just pivots, but like a couple of more such product diseases. And I talk about the 7 most common diseases in the book. It was after such product diseases that I was watching others catch them, that I had this burning question, which was, is it that we're just doomed to learning from these hard lessons, from, trial and error, or is there a step-by-step and systematic process that we can guide people to in being able to have a clear vision and then translate it into everyday actions? So that's what the Radical Product Thinking book is about. And how do you avoid some of these product diseases, also like obsessive sales disorder that we talked about?
Nice. Do you have the book sitting around anywhere so people can see it?
Oh, it's here, right behind me.
There? Nice. And you're working on a new book. Tell us a little bit about what that's all about.
Yeah. So the new book is about why goals and targets don't work. And the reason I came upon this book, right, I mentioned this sort of early on, that I was seeing targets and goals having these negative side effects. But it was also because a lot of people who read Radical Product Thinking, they would come to me and say, I see your ideas of how we can think more long-term, how we can have this clarity of vision, how we can manage, taking on less what I call vision debt, right? It's like technical debt, but you take on less vision debt where you're shortchanging your vision in exchange for short-term gains, right? But I hear your concepts, but I'm driven by OKRs in my company. We're expected to hit these short-term goals constantly. How do I think long-term? Right? And this was one of the key things that I realized, that a lot of people, they were experiencing these same negative side effects of goals and OKRs that I had seen. But the thing is, nobody talks about it openly. It's like the emperor has no clothes, but there's no peasant boy saying, hey, he has no clothes. And it was time that we had that discussion, that OKRs, they don't really work. And it was only in private that people would admit this to me. And every time I would talk about why OKRs don't work, OKR experts would say would offer easy solutions like, okay, if OKRs don't work for you, it's because you're not setting OKRs right. Or, if these goals aren't working for you, it's just because you haven't set the right goals or the right targets, or that you're creating the wrong incentives. Oh, that's easy. Just divorce compensation from OKRs and everything will be all set. I tried a lot of these easy solutions.
Yeah.
And it's not the problem with just how you're implementing OKRs. It's a much more fundamental problem with goals, targets, and OKRs to begin with. And we can talk about, one of my realizations about why it's not even fit for the workforce of today when I look back at history.
Did you ever, you did what you would call easy fixes with the OKR management. Did you ever do the hard fixes? Because one thing I was thinking is a lot of times is you don't have the right people. So the OKRs are great. You just don't have the right people to execute against those OKRs. Did you ever even go that far where you had to kind of rebuild the team thinking it was them and realized, hey, maybe it wasn't them. Maybe the OKRs don't work?
There's a much bigger issue with OKRs than just the teams, right? And yes, I have run into issues where you sometimes realize that with certain people, this is not working out. But, if you're starting to get to a point where you're like, my entire team is not working out, we kind of have to step back and say, okay, what is happening? Like, there has to be a bigger problem because we hired them, and if the entire team is not working out, there's something else that just lying here underneath, right? So let's talk about some of the problems just that I've run into. One thing that I've found is, let's look at where do goals and OKRs or targets actually work. And let's look at why did goal setting even become so entrenched in the corporate world? Like, why goal setting? Why not something else, right? And if you look back in history and where goal setting, etc., came from, you realize that methodologies like OKRs, we think that they're new because John Doerr published a book in 2018 evangelizing OKRs. Larry Page from Google said then, oh yeah, this was our success to Google's, amazing trajectory, etc. But if you just look at where OKRs came from, they're not a new idea at all. Actually, even John Doerr says it came from Andy Grove in the late 1970s. Okay, so then you go back and I looked at where did Andy Grove get this idea of OKRs? And it turned out he took management by objectives from the 1940s. I'm not kidding. 1940s. He took management by objectives and made small tweaks. And so then you go all the way back to the 1940s and you go, how did Peter Drucker come up with goal setting? Why management by objectives? What was the problem he was solving? And therein lies the key to all of this. The problem Peter Drucker was solving at the time was he was working with General Motors, where their workforce was primarily unskilled, working on assembly lines, and there was very little automation. So tasks were repetitive. So it was very easy to tell, by setting goals and targets, here's your targets for how many tires you have to install. And you can easily tell Andy here is a better performer than Bob. He installed 45 tires, Bob installed 40. There's one right way to install tires, right? And now you look at the kind of workforce we have and the problems we're solving. Whatever could be automated has already been automated in most businesses, right? So then you take even a manufacturing problem. Let's look at Boeing. And you take goal setting and you set it on Boeing's manufacturing floors. Okay, so here are your production targets. And then you see the kind of quality issues you have at Boeing where you have panels flying off of airplanes, right? And we wonder what went wrong. Maybe it's a problem with all of the workforce. But seriously, it can't be a problem with the entire Boeing workforce, right? How about we examine what's really going on? And herein lies the problem. Targets create these incentives where it incentivizes employees to show you, ta-da, I've hit those numbers that you were looking for. What is happening, even without that malicious desire, without any malicious desire, I'm looking at the good numbers because I want to please you, right? As a leader, I want to please you and I want to show you these great numbers, things are working. And what happens, just even subconsciously, is all those bad numbers I'm sweeping under the floor. Under the rug. Whereas as a leader, what you really want is you want your entire team to play detective. You want them to solve hard puzzles, look at those bad numbers and say, what is going on? When we are starting to say my entire team is unable to deliver on OKRs, one thing we might want to consider is we've maybe not built that puzzle setting and puzzle solving muscle in our team, which is why they're unable to deliver business results. And so we have to ask ourselves as leaders, how might we build that muscle for experimentation, learning, and adaptation, right? That is the key.
But I agree. I think that's great. But then, there's two thoughts to that. What gets measured gets improved, right? And you also talked about we don't spend enough time looking at the bad numbers and trying to get a story out of it. I actually agree with you. In fact, if I ever do a one-on-one meeting, that's the stuff I focus on. So, but without those OKRs or those KPIs, how would you know those numbers? Because no one would care about numbers and they wouldn't talk about numbers. They would talk about a specific scenario. They would talk about something that they solved that they're proud of. but that might not be as valuable. So how do you combat those things, right? You still need something to look at. You need data to tell a story.
Oh, the data is really important, and measurement is really important. For everything, even though I talk about it as puzzle setting and puzzle solving, it doesn't mean we're not looking at data. On the contrary, instead of just measuring a few target numbers, right, and a few KPIs, I'm measuring with a lot more depth, and I expect that out of my team to be able to really figure out what's happening and be able to tell me the narrative. So there's a lot more rigorous measurement and thinking and critical thinking and analyzing that's happening in what I talk about. So let's talk about the solution, right, and how we might use this. Let's look at the sales example. So, of course, we do want to see business results. Business results are important. But framing it as a puzzle means, instead of just saying your sales target is X million by the end of the year, I would frame this as a puzzle. I would say, the market expects us to hit X million by the end of this year, but I see a puzzle that we need to solve. Sales grew in the last 3 years, but in the last year, they've stalled. What might be happening? And this is the puzzle that I don't have the answer to, that we have to solve. So maybe it is that there's something fundamentally shifted in the market. Maybe a competitor is doing something that, we are just really lagging behind on. Maybe it's that we knew how to sell to the early adopters, but we haven't figured out the right messaging for the mass market. Maybe the problem lies with the product we have, that it works well for the early adopters, but it isn't working for the mass market. So this is the puzzle that I invite my leadership team to figure out with me. Let's define this puzzle. And the objective is a summary of this puzzle, to figure out this puzzle and get back to this growth trajectory so that we can get to X million by the end of the year. So that's the puzzle. Now let's talk about, so by the way, again, even in terms of the puzzle, how I think about it, I'm going to have to do a lot of measurement, right? So how do I solve this puzzle? And here's where the rigor comes in, right? So if I'm the sales team, I might look at, how many meetings am I getting with decision makers? So what I really want to know is my sales message resonating? Maybe it's not resonating and I'm not getting the right level of decision makers. So I try different messaging and now I say, I am starting to get those meetings with decision makers. So then I go on to solve the next thing. Okay, so I'm getting meetings with decision makers, but hey, I'm not closing these deals fast enough. Now what's happening? Oh, it turns out there's this other group within these organizations that I haven't managed to convince. How will I convince them? So the puzzle solving, right, just like puzzle setting, here's the framework for puzzle solving. You ask 3 questions. So the first question is, how well is it working, right? So this is the sales example of, I tested this message. It's working somewhat. I'm still not getting great decision maker meetings, right? Now so this is I look at good and bad. How well is it working? The second question is, what have I learned? So this is where I learned that, okay, now maybe the decision makers are meeting with me, but they're telling me you also need to convince this group. So that brings me to the third question. What will you try next? So based on how well it's working and what you've learned, the third question is, what will you try next? And this is maybe the next thing I'll try, which is, maybe we need white papers for this additional group. Maybe we need a webinar so that, these decision makers can invite all of these people so that we can sell them on it, right? Like in one file swoop, we got them all. This is how we do the puzzle solving, by asking, how well did it work? What have we learned? What are you going to try next? And notice how much more measurement there is than just the sales number. It's not just the sales number. It's a lot more detail that I'm going to question my teams on. And I want to see this depth of puzzle solving, whether it's in sales, whether it is in product. I want to see the depth of puzzle solving by figuring out, what have you learned and what will you try next? I see true capability by looking at all of this.
What do you call that if it's not OKRs?
So I call it OHLs,
OHLs.
Objectives, Hypotheses, and Learnings. But it sounds a bit dry, but it's OHLs. So I like to call it puzzle setting and puzzle solving. And, just like your concern, the words puzzle setting and puzzle solving make it seem like, Are we all off to the playground? Come back when you're done playing. But no, hopefully as you hear the rigor behind OHLs, you see we're not off just to play. This produces real results. And this is what I see in working with companies, that this drives better results than OKRs ever did. And that's been my experience.
Especially in a startup, in the concept of finding product market fit, very scientific, very, very complex problems where I think you're trying to figure out if we even have a solution, a great solution potentially, right? So there you go. What book, idea, or framework most shaped kind of how you think about leadership and building products?
Oh, which book in particular?
Book, idea, framework. It doesn't have to be a book, because you challenge some of the obviously the great books that everybody kind of relies on to set these KPIs, OKRs, and all that, which I understand. But what's shaped you in the other direction?
What has really shaped my willingness to question things, let's say. I like to read a lot, but it's more that I question some of the conventional wisdom. And I'll go back to some of my experience in terms of why I took on this approach. In that first startup where I mentioned, our vision was revolutionizing wireless, I had 4 other co-founders. And, we were just, as I mentioned, in our dorm room starting this company, and I was doing sales, others were doing tech, blah, blah. Like, we all had divided up roles. And all my co-founders seemed so confident it seemed like they knew exactly what to do. And a lot of ideas, they had read and they would go like, oh yeah, this is how we're supposed to do it. And they sounded so confident. I would think, okay, maybe they know better, right? And it took me time to realize, wait a minute, this isn't sitting right by me. And yet I've said maybe they know better. It was more the realization over time that we have to be willing to question the sort of conventional wisdom, because often conventional wisdom exists because we haven't thought of a better way of doing it. And so it is time to see, why did those solutions come up? So if you ask me what books really framed my thinking, I'll say that it's been such a wide variety. I don't read product books by themselves. What I do read are books about so many different things. I'll give you examples. One book is Invisible Women that talks about a lot of data around how we don't include women in testing, whether it's drugs or seat belts, etc., and how that leads to a gap in how we design products, even how we snowblow sidewalks. Then, there are books about Edward Snowden's, for example, Permanent Record. It talks about serious privacy issues and how we need to think about why privacy is important. Then there's this brilliant book called Troubled. It talks about the entire foster care system and why that is problematic. My point is, by reading all of this, we see the whole world as a set of interconnected products and how our thinking needs to evolve as this set of interconnected products. And that's what leads me to change frameworks and conventional thinking.
Why don't they use women in testing? Is there a reason?
Because it makes FDA testing a lot more complicated. Because, if you use women in testing for drugs, for example, well, then what do you include? Do you include pregnant women or not? Do you include women who are on their period or not, or different points in their ovulation cycle when hormones are different? Instead, you pick one category and it's men, so much easier and cheaper. But similarly, even seat belts, if you pick one category, and by the way, if you look at sort of our own biases and who's designing it, who's designing the test, etc., it's very easy to sort of overlook these things.
Oh, interesting. You might as well ask you now, what is your favorite book?
Oh my. One of my favorite books is Michael Schur's book. It's called How to Be Perfect. Okay. And it's a book that is a philosophy book. It is written hilariously. but it gets us to really think about philosophy. 3,000 years of philosophy condensed into one book.
How cool. It sounds like it's humorous.
Exactly. It's the same author of The Good Place, which is a fantastic TV
A
series.
show. We've seen it. My son and
Yes.
I were watching that for a long time, which is very odd. We finished the entire one. Okay. Wow. That's cool. We like the show.
Same
so
author.
we like there you go. Very cool. You I know you talked about OKRs not working. We talked about puzzle solving approach to replacing goals, which is cool. Can you walk us through an example how it played out in practice, whether it was for you or someone else, maybe in sales or product development, how that did actually get the results that you were hoping for?
Yeah, let's talk about this one example where, it was so it's a company called Signal Ocean, and it's in the maritime space. And what Signal Ocean does is it's a data platform that helps you figure out which ships match which cargoes so that you can match ships with cargoes. So I was brought into the company by the CEO about 2 years ago. And the reason I was brought in was because, they had this amazing product. The CEO, in fact, had gone to MIT. They had built this prediction algorithm, etc., and had the most amazing and accurate data forecasting for the maritime industry. And so you would think, whoa, it should be selling like hotcakes. Nobody else had this sort of accuracy. But sales had stalled, and so had usage of the product. So when I was brought in, I started working with the product team to figure out what's happening. Because the CEO had set OKRs. We had aggressive OKRs, aspirational. We were doing OKRs exactly as the book had prescribed. And yet OKRs wasn't leading to any different results. Just reality wasn't changing. And so when I came in and started working with a team, we looked at what is actually happening. And what we discovered was most of our users were tech-savvy users. And, these were tech-savvy users who had our same way of thinking. And they were able to deal with all of the complexity. They loved how accurate our product was. They loved the magic of our product. And what it turned out was most of the maritime industry is actually tech-averse users. And tech-averse people don't like magic. They didn't trust the technology to say, oh, yeah, I'll trust your number. It's more like, wait a minute, how did you come up with that number? I want control. I want a feeling like I know exactly where that number comes from so I can trust it, right? And so that was the puzzle. The puzzle was, how do you get tech-averse people to believe the numbers that we're saying, like to accept this magic, but it can't look like magic. Yet at the same time, you cannot overwhelm them. Well, you can't overwhelm them because if you sort of show what's under the magic, they're like, whoa, this is way too much information. Now you're just overwhelming me with all this stuff, right? So how do you address the needs of this tech-averse user where you give them too much info and it's overwhelming? If you give them too little, it's magic. What do you do? Sounds tough, right? But what's interesting is starting to frame it as a puzzle all of a sudden motivated the team because previously goals and OKRs wasn't. We were hitting or not hitting these goals, but puzzle setting and puzzle solving now started creating this teamwork. It felt like we were all collaborating on solving this puzzle. So how did we go about it? We started using this question of how well is it working? What have you learned? And what will you try next? And so, let's look at one example. We looked at the mobile app. We said, hey, why are people coming to the mobile app? We assumed it was because they wanted to see the same things that they wanted on the desktop, that these lists that they had created, blah, blah, that's what they want to see. How well is it working? It turned out, you know what? We were wrong. That's not what they wanted on the mobile app. And we figured out, okay, so let's look at all the data. And the product manager came back with, I figured out what is the question in the users' heads when they come to the mobile app? So she figured out what are the biggest questions they're coming to the app with. So that was the second question. What have you learned? And then the third question, which is, what will you try next? Based on how well it's working and what she'd learned and like what questions people had in their heads, she came up with a whole new landing page of what we should do instead. Like, here's how we can guide them to answer those questions that they have in their heads, right? And so We completely, thinking in this way, changed so much of the platform and started to address these needs of the tech-averse users that people started to talk about our platform differently. That, wow, you guys are really meeting our needs. You guys have become the standard in the industry. And we changed business results. Remember how I had said 2 years ago, sales had stalled? Well, we doubled sales in 2024. Then we again doubled sales in 2025. Without even trying to hit OKRs, we just doubled sales year over year. And we've reduced churn from 26%. So we reduced customer churn from 26% to 4%. That's a huge difference. And we did all of this by puzzle setting and puzzle solving.
Really good. Really good. That's a perfect example of, I could see where traditional OKRs would absolutely not work in that scenario. Because you would just make more phone calls, have more meetings. You know what? These people don't have power. Go, make sure you're only selling to the higher level people. And that wasn't the issue. It sounded like you had really found a specific issue. That's really good.
But the point that you mentioned is so interesting. Like, it's obvious how this is going to work in smaller companies, right? But let's talk about the bigger companies. Yeah. And I want to go to the example of Intel. I had mentioned how Andy Grove brought in OKRs into Intel. But if you look at what made Intel so successful in the 80s and 90s, and Andy Grove changed the face of Intel, right? It used to be a small memory chips company. It became a household name in microprocessors because of Andy Grove. But it's not because of OKRs that he succeeded. In his book, Only the Paranoid Survive, which, by the way, is a book I loved, in his book, Only the Paranoid Survive, he talks about the need for constant experimentation, learning, and adaptation. He had an intuition for how do you constantly experiment, learn, and adapt. And he was able to drive this across the entire company. And an interesting factoid, he didn't have a corner office. He had a cubicle like everyone else. Why? Because he wanted people to challenge his ideas. His ideas weren't above everyone else. As they experimented and learned, he wanted people to challenge his ideas, right? And so what is fascinating to me is he says that microprocessors, they had to experiment for a decade before that became their line of business. Experiment for a decade. Wow. And so that is just huge. Let's look at what Andy Grove's successors did when they were just following OKRs, when they were driving numbers. Paul Otellini, he drove results. So did Bob Swan and, the guy before him. From 2005 until 2021, you see Intel's trajectory. They were hitting numbers. It was all numbers going up. A wonderful line that moves up and to the right. Great. Looks good. But you know what they did in hitting those numbers? They said no to providing the chipset for iPhone.
Wow.
Yeah. Exactly. Apple went to Intel first and said, would you like to provide our microprocessor? And they said, actually, I don't think we'll make enough money. We're not going to do that. They didn't invest in doing extreme UV lithography. Why is that important? That is extremely expensive technology, but that's what drove the next line of extremely small transistors, the next line of density in semiconductors. They just didn't bother investing in that. They decided not to invest in OpenAI. They decided not to build a standalone GPU, and now NVIDIA is the leader. They fumbled all of these things in hitting OKRs. So my point is, even in large companies, we need to think beyond OKRs. What Andy Grove's success, all of Andy Grove's success, was not because of OKRs. It was because of his ability to experiment, learn, and adapt. And even Andy Grove says, you can't just build this muscle when your company is in trouble. You have to build that muscle all along. And that's what I'd say to leaders. Start now.
That's a really great story. I didn't know that. But would you say on the opposite end, companies sometimes are too innovative and they end up kind of going after so many shiny objects that they end up not having the kind of growth that they had? Because there's that too.
Oh, absolutely. I completely agree with you. I think that's an example of pivotitis, right? Where you don't have clarity on the puzzle that you're really solving. Like, why are you even pursuing that, right? And so this approach of going after lots of shiny objects without really thinking through what is the problem statement? Why must we solve it? Um, how is it related to our business? Why is this an area of growth for us? And why, this whole point of experimentation, learning, and adaptation, we can apply it to the market too. We have to be thinking about our strategic planning and thinking about, how well is our current approach working in terms of our current initiatives? What are we learning from the market and how do we adapt, right? The same three questions of how well is it working? What have we learned? What will we try next? We have to be really systematic in thinking about that and not just place a ton of bets and just keep pivoting.
In this case, it seems like this is a huge company playing not to lose versus really trying to do something great and continue to win. And in their way, they were winning, right? Staying really, really focused, being really linear in their growth. And they got to what they wanted, but they could have been 10 times better potentially, right? Is kind of what the story is here.
Yeah. And, one example that I get reminded of when you say this, I was once leading a visioning session for a leadership team to create alignment on that vision statement I talked about, that fill in the blank statement. And the company was trying to do everything for everyone, right? They were catching strategic swelling and they had placed a ton of bets everywhere, spreading themselves thin. And I was saying, okay, let's look at that problem statement of whose problem are you solving? You could solve the problem for buyers, for sellers, the middlemen, like you can solve it for everyone, but what is the core problem? Like, whose problem do you want to start out by solving? And the CEO said to me, well, we want to be ubiquitous. Don't make me choose one. Right? And it's fascinating because that's what we are taught. Like, we want to be ubiquitous. But my publicist for the first book, I love this quote. She said to me, first start with who has the most urgent need? Who has the most urgent need? Start with that group. You can corner that market, just nail that market, then you can move on to the next. Being ubiquitous doesn't mean you try to do everything everywhere all at once. Maybe we can start, with this clarity of going after one thing, knowing which are the right adjacencies that we want to go after, expanding in a way that makes sense, that you can really, unlike Napoleon trying to go into Russia, we're being very careful about how we expand and where we can dedicate resources and really conquer those markets.
Really good. In a time of wars everywhere, you used a war analogy. I like it. It's like chess.
Troubling too, but
yeah, it's very troubling, but it's become the new norm. It's almost like, I think you even mentioned, it's like you expect leaders to be detectives versus judges. Yeah.
Exactly. But I love that point for one more reason, because even when we're thinking about evaluation, you had brought this up earlier, how do I know if my team is performing, or like maybe the problem is with my team? We often want to be judges as leaders, right? Like this is what we're taught, that that even performance, it's all about performance management. It's about performance evaluation. I want to know, am I going to rate you a 5 or a 3 or a 4? I'm constantly thinking about when I do that next round of layoffs, who am I going to lay off? Like, who's my bottom 10%? But the reality is, right, what we really need to think about as leaders, the less we're judgmental, the more we focus on development as opposed to evaluation, the more people are open to our feedback. And the more you can do continuous feedback to get people to do better. In everything that I described at Signal Ocean, I was constantly pushing that team in terms of how they were solving that puzzle. What have we learned? What are we going to do? How well is it working? What have we learned? What are we going to do next? I was constantly pushing the team. But when you're not feeling evaluated, I'm able to push them that much more because they want to learn. They're motivated in getting better. Like that's the thing about high performers. High performers want to constantly learn, do better. They want to solve bigger puzzles. That's what drives them. This is like catnip for your high performers as opposed to goals and OKRs, which is demotivating for high performers because all they see is the performance theater that it incentivizes.
Wow, performance theater. If you were mentoring a young executive who's about to step into a leadership role for the first time, or a very high level role, what's the most personal piece of advice you'd give them? What good advice would you give them?
One thing as a leader is it's really helpful to think about this for yourself. Like, take an initiative that you've worked on and try this exercise of puzzle setting and puzzle solving. And, even for your team, as you go in and you want to set a culture, go in and talk about this approach and just even what you've learned from this initiative that you worked on. Right? So you worked on an initiative. Clearly, there must have been some things that worked well, some things that didn't go well. So use this format of how well did it work? What did I learn? And what would I try next? Or what will we do next? And when you present this as an executive, you're helping create this mindset in your entire team. You're telling them it's okay to tell me the good and the bad, right? Because what you really want as an executive is you want them to give you the good and the bad news. So you're showing them it's okay to do that. And then, you yourself are building that empathy for how hard it is to think through what have I learned from this, being able to present that, and what will we do next? And by creating this culture, you're not just setting OKRs now and expecting people to execute. You're creating a culture where people can continue to do this irrespective of OKRs, that you can constantly see this puzzle setting and puzzle solving. What you'll start to observe is people will come to you with the next puzzle that's going to grow your business. They'll come to you and say, you know what, I think we need to solve this puzzle next. Here are my ideas for what to do next. And that's what you want in your company, to spread these ideas, to grow your influence. And this is one of the ways you can do it.
That's great. You're hopefully reshaping how leaders think about vision and goals. Looking ahead, what do you hope your work inspires, first book, second book, in the next generation of leaders? Like, what would you like to see that would make you very proud?
The biggest thing to me is leaders being willing to challenge conventional wisdom and wanting to find ways, rather than, saying, oh, this would be too hard for me to implement, finding ways to say, how can I implement this? How can I challenge some of these ideas in my organization? How can I bring in, these new ideas? And I think that's really hard to do as a leader. And in both of my books, I'm talking, in the Radical Product Thinking book, you'll see the step-by-step process of how do I bring this into my organization. But in the second book I'm working on as well, I talk about some of these tips in terms of what can you do to bring this into your organization and create a culture of continuous learning in your organization?
I think it's got to be more exciting too. You have leaders that are like having the same meeting week after week after week after week, and like, all right, you didn't hit your numbers. What happened? Okay, all right, you got to do more of this, less of that. It must get really exhausting, right? And so this could be very inspiring to use a different concept and see how the players react.
This is exactly what I've heard from so many people. So many people have said to me, in OKR monthly business reviews, what often happens is we're all talking at each other and we're talking about proving that our numbers are green or yellow, at worst red, right? Like there's all of this talking at each other in terms of justification, defensiveness, etc. And what I've seen is when you start to shift to this conversation of how well did it work? What have we learned? What are we going to do next? It completely shifts this conversation to insightful conversations where everyone is suddenly collaboratively, sharing ideas and thinking about, oh, maybe we should try this together. It creates this sense of collaboration across the organization. And there's one last tip that I would share for leaders, which is, don't feel like you have to kind of abandon OKRs from day one. Like, I empathize with you. One of the big things is it's scary to say, I'm going to stop doing all of this stuff that I've learned for decades how to do, and now suddenly I'm gonna, say I'm gonna do puzzle setting and puzzle solving. You know what? You can start with a baby step. That's what I'd say. Start with a baby step where a lot of leaders first ask, does my team have the capability to really, even be rigorous about measurement, to solve puzzles in this way? Will they be rigorous and do this? How well did it work? What have I learned? What will I try next? And so introduce this to your team. Start to get them to puzzle solve. Have them present this information to you in these ways. Have one-on-ones where you see their ability develop, give them feedback. And then you can keep growing this and build momentum around it.
Sometimes I'm wondering if it could backfire. Sometimes we're surrounded by folks that like to deflect, right? It's never them, and it's not their focus or their effort or their strategy or whatever. It's, unfortunately, the market sucks, and, you guys don't have the right collateral, and, this and that, and too many meetings, and da-da-da. Like, could this backfire into a lot of these kind of, I don't want to call it nonsense because there's always some truth to it, but these unnecessary conversations where everything is a deflection versus looking inward?
It's such a great point in terms of what I observe with the current issue of OKRs, because what happens is when you're constantly feeling like, whether my OKRs are red, yellow, and green, it affects how I'm perceived. It affects whether someone thinks of me as a high performer or not. There's a lot of deflection, right? It's so ironic that OKRs are supposed to drive accountability, but what actually happens is there's a lot of deflection because I don't want to look like a bad performer. I want to say that, you know what, if this is yellow, it's because marketing didn't deliver the right material to me, and or product didn't deliver the product in time. I didn't have enough time to sell it this quarter, right? So this is what happens with OKRs. There's a lot of deflection. What I've seen actually with puzzle setting and puzzle solving is there's a lot more ownership, that instead of the deflection, what I get a clear sense of, and this is something that I noticed, like there were some people in the team who under OKRs used to present great numbers to me. When they started presenting this information to me in terms of how well did it work, what have I learned, what will I try next, I delved into just a couple of more layers of, so you told me you learned this. Oh, but you're showing me these numbers. Wait a minute. You're saying this number, it comes from the dashboard, and 45% of people are using this feature. But that is the feature that they land on. So is that the feature? So is the 45% because they landed on it or they came back to it? Like, help me understand. And I would start to see with a little bit of such, delving that, I'm not seeing the kind of depth of thinking that I wanted to see, right? My point is, there's more accountability I actually get from how well did it work? What have I learned? What will I try next? People don't come to me unprepared because it's not criticism of them. I'm not being mean. I just want to see depth, right? And I'm not shooting the messenger. I will welcome the bad news if I feel like you've truly understood that puzzle and you now you may not even have a plan for what you're going to do. If you describe the puzzle well enough, we can figure it out together. But if I don't see a depth of thinking, I'm going to push you on it. That's where true accountability comes from. Like, let's work together on solving the puzzle, but come to me, like really thinking through things, and I'm going to challenge you. We'll challenge each other. Similarly, if you're not seeing the same thing for me, you're welcome to challenge my own findings. So what if we try this?
That's really good. Really good. And I do see what you said. It doesn't have to be a replacement of OKRs. It could just be a problem-solving mindset right off the bat. It can be used tomorrow. Final thought, if you could plaster one piece of advice on a billboard for every founder and executive to see, what would it say?
Don't do founder mode.
Okay, tell us what that means.
So there's this whole fad that came out of Silicon Valley, and it's all about founder mode. And there's this perception or this idea And the way it came about was Brian Chesky from Airbnb. He said founder mode is where, founders, they start the company, they know best, they understand the market, they understand the customer. And, therefore, we should operate in founder mode, because if you're not in founder mode, other people coming in don't know enough about the business and they bring the business down. Turns out that really is not true. This is, us as leaders wanting to say, you know what, here's why I don't delegate, because nobody else can do it as well as I can.
Yep.
The real answer, I think, is you shouldn't have to be in founder mode. Like, we all need to understand the business well enough that when my engineers see I'm asking for a particular feature, they should be able to question me and say, hey, I see you're asking for this. Did you actually mean this? They should be able to call out my mistakes. This is kind of what I had built up in previous roles that I worked at, where, I only knew that I'd communicated the vision and what we needed to do well enough if someone could challenge me and I would say, yeah, you know what? You're right. I was wrong. That means, we are spreading knowledge across our company well enough that if I'm not around in that particular meeting, I know that they will go do the right thing. So don't do founder mode. Even OKRs and goals, they are set from this mentality of, as a leader, I know this is the right problem and this is the right solution. Therefore, I'm setting these goals. Exactly. That my role is figuring out the problem and the solution. You go execute. And which is why founder mode is not the right approach. What you want is, like Andy Grove, people on the front lines to tell you what's actually happening. They should have enough insights.
You know what's worse than founder mode, I would imagine, is successful second time founder mode. I mean, so many people have one successful exit. They come out and they're gods, right? And investors don't question them. I mean, I'm an investor myself, and when we hear that, you're like, yeah, this guy's great. Oh, this lady's awesome. Just invest, they'll figure it out. And now they have God complex, right? They think they're untouchable. And you got the founder mode concept, and they're just going to derail anybody that questions them. Would you agree?
Oh, I love what you said. The very foundation of experimentation, learning, adaptation rests on this idea that I just may be wrong. And what you just described is that we take away that foundation that I may be wrong, and you no longer have experimentation, learning, and adaptation when I know everything.
Dead on. We got to end on that note. Thank you, Radhika, for showing us that leadership isn't about chasing every target. It's about solving the right puzzles with clarity. For listeners who want to dive deeper, her book, Radical Product Thinking, is available everywhere, I believe. Right?
Yes. And they can download the OHLs template. You can go to this link that I'm happy to share, and we can include that in the show notes.
Great.
It's an OHLs template that's in slides format. You can start to use this right away. And by the way, I'm working on the book as we speak. So if you have stories because you've used OHLs and you want to tell me about your struggles or how well it worked for you, I would love to listen to your stories, and they may just make it into the book as a case study. So feel free to share. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn and download the OHLs toolkit.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. It's been an absolute pleasure. Appreciate you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And that brings us to the end of another great episode of the Tech Leaders Playbook. I want to thank you for joining us, and I hope you took away some valuable insights to apply in your professional journey. Don't forget to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform so you don't miss out on the next great conversation. I promise it'll be good. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd appreciate if you could leave us a review. Your feedback not only helps us improve, but also help others discover the podcast. Better leaders mean better working environments. Better working environments leads to happier people. Remember, a rising tide lifts all boats. I'm Avetis Antaplyan, and this has been the Tech Leaders Playbook. Keep leading, keep learning, keep giving, and I'll see you on the next one. Until then, stay inspired, my friends.